The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Blue Ridge Historical Society in Asheville, North Carolina, casting golden rectangles across the polished wooden floors. Dr. Margaret Chen adjusted her reading glasses as she carefully laid the fragile photograph on the conservation table, her gloved hands treating the century-old image with the reverence it deserved. The photograph had arrived in a donation box 3 weeks earlier, part of an estate sale from a farmhouse in the remote hills of Madison County. Among hundreds of mundane family snapshots and faded documents, this particular wedding photograph had caught her attention immediately. The image showed a typical Appalachian wedding scene from the turn of the 20th century. A young bride stood in the center, her white lace dress simple but elegant, clutching a bouquet of mountain laurel. The groom beside her wore a dark suit that looked slightly too large, his expression serious and proud. Around them stood approximately 20 people, family and friends arranged in 3 rows on the wooden porch of what appeared to be a modest farmhouse. Behind them, the misty blue mountains of the Appalachians rose in layers, creating a dramatic backdrop that spoke to the isolation and beauty of rural North Carolina in that era. Margaret had been a historical photograph specialist for 15 years, and she had developed an eye for details that others might miss. She reached for her magnifying glass and began her standard examination process, starting from the left side of the photograph and moving methodically across each face. The clothing dated the photograph precisely. The women wore high-necked blouses with leg-of-mutton sleeves, their hair swept up in the Gibson girl style that had dominated the early 1900s. The men's suits featured the characteristic high-waisted trousers and narrow lapels of the period. As she moved her magnifying glass across the 3rd row of guests, Margaret paused. A young woman stood at the far left, wearing a simple gray dress with a white collar. She had dark hair pulled back severely, and her face bore a striking resemblance to the bride. Sisters, Margaret thought, noting the similar bone structure and the identical shape of their eyes. She made a mental note and continued her examination. When her magnifying glass reached the far right side of the photograph, Margaret stopped abruptly. Her heart began to beat faster. Standing at the opposite end of the same row was what appeared to be the exact same young woman, wearing the identical gray dress with white collar, the same severe hairstyle, the same distinctive features. Margaret blinked and looked again, certain her eyes were deceiving her. She set down the magnifying glass and stepped back from the table, removing her reading glasses to rub her tired eyes. It had been a long day, and she had been cataloging donations since early morning. Perhaps fatigue was causing her to see things that weren't there. But when she looked again, the reality remained unchanged. The same woman appeared to be standing in 2 different positions in the same photograph. Margaret's mind raced through possible explanations. In the early 1900s, photography was still a developing art, and double exposures were not uncommon. Photographers sometimes accidentally exposed the same plate twice, creating ghostly overlapping images. But this didn't look like a double exposure. Both versions of the woman appeared solid and clear, with no transparency or ghosting effect. Moreover, they occupied completely different spaces in the composition, and the lighting on both figures matched the ambient conditions perfectly. Another possibility was that the photograph had been manipulated after development, perhaps with clever darkroom techniques or even basic cut-and-paste methods. Margaret had seen examples of Victorian photographic trickery, often used to create amusing novelty images or to add deceased family members to group portraits. But as she examined the photograph more closely under bright light, she could detect no evidence of physical manipulation. The emulsion appeared consistent across the entire surface, with no visible seams, discoloration, or irregularities that would indicate post-processing tampering. The most logical explanation, though still unusual, was that the photographer had employed a technique called chronophotography, popular among experimental photographers of that era. If the camera's exposure time was long enough, and if one person moved quickly from one position to another while the shutter remained open, that person could appear twice in the final image. But such techniques were typically used in controlled studio environments, not at outdoor wedding celebrations in rural Appalachia. Moreover, the woman in both positions appeared completely still and natural, with no motion blur whatsoever. Margaret pulled up a chair and sat down, staring at the photograph with renewed fascination. Something about this image felt intentional, deliberate. She turned the photograph over carefully, hoping to find identifying information on the back. The cardboard backing was yellowed and brittle, but she could make out handwriting in faded brown ink. The script was ornate and difficult to read, but Margaret was experienced in deciphering 19th-century penmanship. Wedding of James and Catherine Howard. She read aloud slowly, June 15, 1901. Taken by Thomas Garrett, traveling photographer. Present were members of the Howard and Sullivan families. Below that, in different handwriting that appeared to have been added later, perhaps decades after the original notation, was a single cryptic line that made Margaret's breath catch. May God forgive us all for what we did to Abigail. The name Abigail sent Margaret immediately back to the photograph. She examined both versions of the mysterious woman again, committing every detail to memory. Who was Abigail? Was she the bride's sister, as Margaret had initially assumed? And what could that ominous message possibly mean? The phrase, "what we did to Abigail," suggested some collective action, some shared guilt among the wedding guests. But what could have happened at a rural wedding in 1901 that would warrant such a haunting posthumous confession? Margaret pulled out her laptop and began documenting her findings. She photographed the image from multiple angles, using both standard and raking light to capture every detail. She measured the dimensions, noted the condition, and transcribed all the handwritten information from the back. Then she began the painstaking process of trying to identify the individuals in the photograph. The donation records indicated that the photograph had come from the estate of Eleanor Howard Paxton, who had died at age 97 in her family home in Mars Hill, North Carolina. The house had been in the Howard family for over a century, passing down through multiple generations. Eleanor had never married and had no direct descendants, so her possessions had been distributed among various cousins, with many items donated to the Historical Society. Margaret spent the next hours searching through census records, marriage certificates, and county archives. The 1900 census for Madison County revealed a James Howard, age 23, living with his parents and 3 siblings on a farm in the Shelton-Laurel Valley. In 1901, just after the photograph would have been taken, James appeared in marriage records, having wed Catherine Sullivan, age 20. Catherine's family was listed as living on an adjacent property, a common arrangement in the tight-knit communities of Appalachian settlements. But it was the discovery of another name that made Margaret sit up straight. Listed in the Sullivan household in the 1900 census were Catherine Sullivan, age 19, her parents Patrick and Mary Sullivan, 2 younger brothers, and a sister named Abigail Sullivan, age 17. Margaret's pulse quickened. This had to be the same Abigail mentioned in the cryptic note on the back of the photograph. She continued searching, but the trail grew cold almost immediately. Abigail Sullivan appeared in the 1900 census but disappeared entirely from public records after that date. There was no marriage record, no death certificate, no property transaction, no mention in any subsequent census. It was as if she had simply vanished from existence sometime between 1900 and the next census in 1910. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning with questions. In rural Appalachia at the turn of the century, there were several reasons why a young woman might disappear from official records. She could have married and moved away, though this seemed unlikely given the close-knit nature of mountain communities and the absence of any marriage record. She could have died, though the lack of a death certificate was puzzling. Or something else could have happened, something that the family wanted to keep hidden, something that had haunted them enough that decades later, someone felt compelled to leave that cryptic, guilt-ridden message on the back of a wedding photograph. The late afternoon sun had shifted, and the Historical Society building had grown quiet around her. Margaret glanced at her watch and realized it was nearly 6 o'clock. She had been so absorbed in the photograph that she had lost track of time entirely. She carefully placed the photograph in an archival sleeve and locked it in the climate-controlled storage vault. But as she gathered her things to leave for the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled onto something significant, a mystery that had remained hidden for over a century. As Margaret drove home through the winding mountain roads, the autumn colors brilliant against the darkening sky, she couldn't stop thinking about Abigail Sullivan. What had happened to her? Why did she appear twice in her sister's wedding photograph? And what had the family done that required divine forgiveness? That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and her laptop, unable to let the mystery rest. She searched through digitized newspaper archives from Madison County, looking for any mention of the Sullivan or Howard families in 1901 and the years immediately following. Most of the articles were mundane, reporting on agricultural fairs, church socials, and local political meetings. But then she found something that made her heart skip a beat. In the Marshall News record dated September 1901, just 3 months after the wedding photograph had been taken, there was a brief article tucked between advertisements for patent medicines and farm equipment. The headline read, "Local family seeks information on missing daughter." The article was short, only 3 sentences long, but its content was electrifying. Mr. and Mrs. Patrick Sullivan of Shelton Laurel are searching for their daughter, Abigail, age 17, who left home in late June and has not been heard from since. Miss Sullivan is described as having dark hair and brown eyes, standing approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Sullivan family. Margaret read the article 3 times, committing every word to memory. So Abigail had disappeared in late June 1901, just weeks after her sister's wedding on June 15th. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Something had happened at or around that wedding, something connected to the mysterious photograph, something that had caused a 17-year-old girl to leave home and never return. Margaret arrived at the Historical Society early the next morning, her mind buzzing with theories and questions. She had barely slept, spending most of the night researching the Sullivan and Howard families, trying to piece together fragments of information scattered across census records, land deeds, and newspaper archives. The mystery of Abigail Sullivan had consumed her completely, transforming from a professional curiosity into something more personal, more urgent. She made herself a strong cup of coffee and returned to the conservation table where the photograph lay waiting in its archival sleeve. In the clear morning light, the image seemed even more haunting than it had the previous day. Margaret pulled out a magnifying glass and began examining every detail with fresh eyes, looking for clues she might have missed. The 2 versions of Abigail Sullivan were positioned at opposite ends of the same row, creating a strange symmetry in the composition. Margaret noticed that in both positions, Abigail's expression was identical, a neutral, almost blank look that contrasted sharply with the smiles on most of the other faces. Her posture in both images was rigid, her hands clasped in front of her, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she were trying to make herself smaller, less visible. Margaret turned her attention to the other people in the photograph, studying their faces and body language. The bride, Catherine Sullivan Howard, stood in the center, radiant despite the serious expression typical of photographs from that era. She held her bouquet of mountain laurel with white-knuckled intensity, and if Margaret looked closely, she could see a tension in Catherine's jaw, a tightness around her eyes that suggested something more complex than wedding day jitters. The groom, James Howard, looked younger than his 23 years, his face still carrying the softness of adolescence beneath the attempted gravitas of his wedding day suit. He stood slightly apart from his bride, not touching her, his hands hanging awkwardly at his sides. Margaret wondered if this distance was simply a convention of formal photography or if it reflected something deeper in their relationship. As Margaret continued her examination, she noticed something she had overlooked before. Standing directly behind the bride was an older woman, probably in her 50s, with stern features and iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. The woman's hand rested on Catherine's shoulder, the grip appearing firm, almost possessive. Margaret checked the census records again. This would likely be Mary Sullivan, Catherine, and Abigail's mother. What struck Margaret was the direction of Mary Sullivan's gaze. While everyone else in the photograph looked at the camera, Mary was staring to the side, her eyes fixed on something outside the frame. Margaret followed the angle of that gaze and realized with a chill that Mary was looking directly at where Abigail stood at the far right of the photograph. Margaret needed more information, more context. She spent the morning making phone calls to other historical societies, genealogical associations, and university archives throughout western North Carolina. She spoke with local historians who specialized in Appalachian culture, asking about photographic practices, family dynamics, and the kinds of secrets that mountain families might have kept hidden. One conversation proved particularly illuminating. Dr. Robert Hendricks, a retired professor of Appalachian studies from Western Carolina University, listened intently as Margaret described the photograph and her findings. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line before he spoke. "You've stumbled onto something that was probably quite common in those communities, though it's rarely documented," Dr. Hendricks said, his voice thoughtful. In the early 1900s, photographers were expensive, especially in rural areas. When someone like Thomas Garrett came through, traveling with his equipment, it might be the only chance a family had to create a photographic record. These weren't just pictures, they were historical documents, meant to preserve family history for future generations. "I understand that," Margaret replied, "but why would they want a photograph that shows one person twice? Wouldn't that be seen as a mistake?" "Not necessarily," Dr. Hendricks continued. "Sometimes photographers would deliberately create these double images, especially if there was a family member who couldn't be present for the photograph. They might take the exposure twice, having someone stand in different positions to represent both themselves and the absent person. It was a way of including someone in the family record even if they weren't actually there." Margaret felt a spark of understanding. "So you think one of the Abigails in the photograph isn't actually Abigail? That someone else was standing in for her?" "It's possible," Dr. Hendricks said. "Or perhaps Abigail was there for the photograph but was already planning to leave, and the photographer created the double image as a kind of farewell, a way of capturing her presence more fully before she disappeared." These mountain families had their own ways of dealing with loss and absence. Sometimes those ways were symbolic, even ritualistic. After the call, Margaret sat in silence, contemplating this new interpretation. If Dr. Hendricks was right, the photograph wasn't evidence of photographic trickery or accidental double exposure. It was intentional, meaningful, a deliberate attempt to capture something that the family knew was about to be lost. That afternoon, Margaret decided she needed to visit Madison County herself. She wanted to see the landscape where this story had unfolded, to walk the same ground that the Sullivan and Howard families had walked, to breathe the same mountain air. Sometimes, she had learned over years of historical research, understanding came not from documents and records but from direct experience with the places where history had happened. The drive from Asheville to Marshall took about 30 minutes, following the French Broad River through increasingly narrow valleys. Margaret continued north toward the Shelton-Laurel Valley, a remote area that had maintained its isolation well into the 20th century. The road wound higher into the mountains, past weathered farmhouses and churches with tiny graveyards, past forests of oak and poplar that blazed with autumn color. When she reached what the old maps indicated was the Shelton-Laurel community, Margaret pulled over at a small country store, its wooden siding painted a fading red. The store looked like it had been there for decades, maybe even a century, serving as a gathering place for the scattered mountain residents. Inside, the floorboards creaked under her feet, and the air smelled of coffee and old wood. An elderly man sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He looked up as Margaret entered, his weathered face creasing into a welcoming smile. "Help you with something, miss?" "I hope so," Margaret said, returning his smile. "I'm a researcher from the Historical Society in Asheville, and I'm trying to learn about some families that lived in this area back in 1900. The Sullivans and the Howards. Do those names mean anything to you?" The man's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Sullivan and Howard," he repeated slowly. "Well, those are old names around here, sure enough. What's your interest in them?" Margaret explained about the photograph, carefully watching the man's reaction. As she spoke, she saw recognition flicker in his eyes, followed by something else, something that looked almost like discomfort. "The wedding photo," he said quietly. "I've heard stories about that photograph. My grandmother used to mention it sometimes, though she never wanted to talk about it much. Said it was a sad business, what happened with that family." "What did happen?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice casual, not wanting to push too hard and shut down the conversation. The man was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh how much he wanted to reveal. "I'm Charles Hensley," he finally said. "My grandmother was Emma Hensley, born Emma Norton. She was a friend of the Sullivan girls growing up, went to school with them in that little one-room schoolhouse that used to stand down by the creek. She's been gone 20 years now, but she told me some stories when I was young, before she decided there were things better left in the past. "I'd appreciate anything you could tell me," Margaret said gently. "I'm not trying to cause problems or dredge up old scandals. I'm just trying to understand the photograph and the people in it." Charles nodded slowly, then gestured to a small table near the window. "Sit down then. If you're going to understand anything about that photo, you need to understand what life was like up here in those days." As Margaret sat, Charles poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on a hot plate and joined her at the table. Outside the window, the mountains rose in layers, disappearing into mist, just as they had in the wedding photograph. "Shelton Laurel was isolated back then," Charles began, "more than it is now, and that's saying something. Families up here were close-knit, everybody related to everybody else somehow. The Sullivan family had a farm up on the ridge, nothing fancy but enough to get by. Patrick Sullivan was known as a hard man, religious, strict. His wife Mary was cut from the same cloth. They had high expectations for their children, especially the girls." Charles paused, sipping his coffee. Catherine, the older daughter, she was the responsible one, did everything right, everything her parents wanted. When James Howard started courting her, the families approved. James came from good stock, had prospects, would make a good husband and provider. The wedding in 1901 was a big event for the community, brought everyone together. "And Abigail?" Margaret prompted gently. Charles's expression darkened. "Abigail was different. My grandmother said she was spirited, independent-minded. That didn't sit well with her father, not in those days. Women were supposed to be obedient, help with the farm work, marry young, have children. Abigail had other ideas. She wanted to go to the normal school in Asheville, wanted to become a teacher. Her father wouldn't hear of it." "So what happened at the wedding?" "That's where the stories get murky," Charles admitted. "My grandmother never told me everything, said some things were private family matters. But she did say that Abigail wasn't supposed to be at that wedding. There had been some kind of falling out, an argument between Abigail and her father in the weeks before. Something serious enough that Patrick Sullivan told Abigail she wasn't welcome at her own sister's wedding." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "But she was in the photograph." "That's the thing," Charles said, leaning forward. "According to my grandmother, Abigail did come to the wedding, showed up uninvited. There was a scene, some kind of confrontation. The photographer, this fellow Garrett who traveled through the mountains, he witnessed the whole thing. My grandmother said he felt sorry for Abigail, saw how the family was treating her. So when it came time for the wedding photograph, he did something unusual." Charles paused and Margaret waited, hardly breathing. "He took 2 photographs," Charles continued. "The first one was the official family portrait, with everyone positioned properly, everything correct and formal. But Abigail was standing off to the side, not included, because her father had forbidden it. Then Garrett suggested rearranging people for a second shot. During that rearrangement, while people were milling about, he took another exposure without anyone fully realizing it, and in that one, Abigail was included. Later, back in his darkroom, he combined those 2 exposures into a single print. The result was that strange photograph where Abigail appears twice, once where her father wanted her, invisible and excluded, and once where she belonged, with her family." Margaret sat back, absorbing this information. It was a stunning revelation, but it also raised more questions. Why would the family keep a photograph that reminded them of such a painful moment? "That's something I've wondered myself," Charles said. "Maybe it was guilt. Maybe after Abigail left and never came back, they wanted to remember her, even if the memory was complicated. Or maybe Catherine insisted on keeping it, wanting some record of her sister being at her wedding, even if it was only in that strange, divided way." "Do you know what happened to Abigail after she left?" Charles shook his head. "My grandmother said Abigail disappeared a few weeks after the wedding. Took what little she had and walked down to Marshall, then somehow made her way to Asheville. Some folks said she got work in one of the hotels, others said she went further, maybe to Charlotte or even Atlanta. Nobody knew for sure, and the Sullivan family never talked about her again. As far as they were concerned, she had shamed them, disobeyed her father, chosen the world over her family. In those days, that was an unforgivable sin. Margaret thought about the note on the back of the photograph. "May God forgive us all for what we did to Abigail." Who had written that? And what exactly had they done? As if reading her thoughts, Charles said, "There's one more thing you should know. Catherine, the bride, she never had an easy life. She and James Howard stayed married, had 3 children, lived on that farm for 50 years. But my grandmother said Catherine always carried a sadness with her, a sense of loss that never quite went away. When Catherine was dying, back in the 1950s, she asked for that wedding photograph to be brought to her. She stared at it for a long time, then said something that stuck with my grandmother. She said, 'I should have stopped them. I should have stood up for her.' Then she asked someone to write something on the back of the photograph, something about forgiveness. My grandmother always thought that note was Catherine's way of admitting that the family had been wrong, that they had driven Abigail away and had lived with that guilt for decades." Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes. This wasn't just a historical mystery anymore. It was a human tragedy, a story of family loyalty versus individual freedom, of the crushing weight of expectations and the courage it took to defy them. Margaret returned to Asheville as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Charles Hensley's revelations had given her a deeper understanding of the photograph and the Sullivan family story, but they had also raised new questions. Most pressingly, what had actually happened to Abigail Sullivan after she left Shelton Laurel in the summer of 1901? Over the next several days, Margaret threw herself into research with renewed determination. If Abigail had made it to Asheville, there might be records. The city in 1901 was experiencing a boom period, with new hotels and businesses opening regularly. Young women from the mountains often came to town seeking work as maids, laundresses, or shop assistants. It was hard work and the pay was minimal, but for someone like Abigail, seeking independence from a restrictive family, it might have represented freedom. Margaret started with city directories from 1901 and 1902, carefully scanning every name. The directories listed residents by occupation and address, creating a snapshot of urban life at the turn of the century. At first, she found nothing. Then, in the 1902 directory, she spotted it: Sullivan, Abigail, domestic, boarding at Mrs. Fletcher's, 47 Haywood Street. Margaret's heart raced. This had to be her. The timing was right, and the occupation matched what Charles had suggested. Margaret immediately searched for more information about the boarding house on Haywood Street. Mrs. Fletcher's establishment appeared in several directories as a respectable lodging house for working women, run by a widow named Harriet Fletcher. These boarding houses served an important function in early 20th century cities, providing safe, affordable housing for young women working in town, often with strict rules about behavior and visitors. But the trail went cold again after 1902. Abigail's name didn't appear in the 1903 directory or any subsequent years. Margaret expanded her search, looking through church records, hospital admissions, employment records from hotels and businesses, anything that might capture Abigail's presence in the city. Days passed with little progress, and Margaret began to feel the familiar frustration of historical research, where crucial information often remained just beyond reach. Then, almost by accident, she found something. While searching through digitized newspapers from 1903, looking for any mention of the Sullivan name, Margaret discovered a brief article in the Asheville Citizen about a new school opening on the outskirts of town. The article listed the teachers hired for the upcoming term, and among them was Miss A. Sullivan, formerly of Madison County, who will instruct the primary grades. Margaret read the article 3 times, a smile spreading across her face. Abigail had done it. She had achieved her dream of becoming a teacher, defying her father's wishes and creating a new life for herself. Margaret imagined the determination it must have taken for a young woman in 1903, with minimal education and no family support, to qualify for a teaching position. Abigail must have studied on her own, perhaps attending night classes or working with sympathetic teachers who recognized her intelligence and dedication. This discovery opened new avenues for research. Margaret contacted the Buncombe County School System's Historical Records Department, hoping to find more information about Abigail's teaching career. After several days of searching through old employment records and school board minutes, an archivist named Tom Bradford called her back with intriguing news. "I found quite a bit about your Abigail Sullivan," Tom said, excitement evident in his voice. "She taught in the county school system for over 30 years, from 1903 until 1934. She started at that little school on Tunnel Road and eventually became the principal of the Riverside Elementary School. Her employment file is actually quite detailed for that era. It seems she was highly respected, known for being firm but fair with students, and particularly committed to teaching children from poor mountain families." "That's wonderful," Margaret said, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "Did she ever marry?" "No. According to the records, she remained Miss Sullivan throughout her career. That wasn't unusual for female teachers in that era. Many school districts had policies requiring women to resign if they married, so career teachers often stayed single. But here's something interesting: she lived for many years at the same boarding house on Haywood Street, the one you mentioned. According to some newspaper articles I found, she was very involved in community work, particularly with organizations that helped young women from rural areas adjust to city life. It seems she dedicated herself to helping others avoid the difficulties she must have faced herself." Margaret felt a lump forming in her throat. Abigail hadn't just survived her break from her family, she had thrived, building a meaningful life dedicated to education and service. "Is there any indication she ever reconciled with her family?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "I didn't find anything suggesting that, no. But I did find an obituary from 1951, when she died at age 68. It's quite detailed and lists her accomplishments, but there's no mention of surviving family members, which usually would be included. It describes her as a beloved teacher and community figure, lists organizations she belonged to and charitable work she supported. But when it comes to family, there's only this line: Miss Sullivan is survived by numerous former students who regarded her as a second mother." That phrase always struck me as both beautiful and profoundly sad. After the call with Tom, Margaret sat in her office, staring at the wedding photograph that had started this entire investigation. She now knew the full story, or at least as much as could be reconstructed from historical records and local memory. Abigail Sullivan had been a young woman trapped between two worlds: the traditional mountain community with its strict expectations and the emerging modern world with its promise of education and independence. At her sister's wedding in June 1901, she had been caught in that tension, both present and absent, included and excluded, captured in a photographer's creative act of compassion in two positions simultaneously. Within weeks of that wedding, Abigail had made the difficult decision to leave her family and community, walking away from everything she had known to pursue her dream of becoming a teacher. It must have been terrifying, a 17-year-old girl with minimal resources, venturing into the city alone. But she had done it, and she had succeeded, creating a life of purpose and meaning that touched hundreds of students over 3 decades. Margaret thought about Catherine, the bride in the photograph, who had lived with guilt and regret for driving her sister away. She thought about the note on the back of the photograph, written decades later as Catherine lay dying: "May God forgive us all for what we did to Abigail." Catherine had recognized, too late, that her family had been wrong to reject Abigail for wanting something more than the prescribed path of marriage and motherhood. She had understood that by choosing family loyalty over supporting her sister's dreams, she had lost Abigail forever. But the tragedy wasn't just personal, it was cultural. Margaret had spent her career studying Appalachian history, and she knew that Abigail's story was echoed in countless other lives. The early 20th century had been a time of profound change in the mountains, as young people encountered new ideas through improved education and increased contact with urban areas. Many families, like the Sullivans, had struggled to reconcile traditional values with their children's aspirations. Some families adapted, others rigidly enforced old ways, and the resulting conflicts often split families apart permanently. Margaret decided she wanted to visit Abigail's grave, to pay her respects to a woman whose courage and determination had impressed her deeply. Tom had mentioned that the obituary listed Riverside Cemetery as the burial location. The next morning, Margaret drove to the cemetery, a peaceful place on the outskirts of Asheville with ancient trees and weathered tombstones dating back to the 19th century. It took some time to locate the grave, but eventually she found it in a section designated for unmarried women of modest means. The tombstone was simple, just a small granite marker with basic information. Abigail Sullivan, 1883 to 1951, beloved teacher. But someone had left fresh flowers, a small bouquet of mountain laurel, the same wildflower Catherine had carried in her wedding bouquet 50 years earlier. Margaret knelt beside the grave, wondering who had left the flowers. A former student, perhaps, or someone from the community organizations Abigail had supported. Or could it have been a family member, a niece or nephew who had learned about the aunt they had never been allowed to know? As Margaret stood to leave, an elderly woman approached, carrying a watering can. She had the distinctive features of the mountain people, the same bone structure Margaret had seen in the faces of the Sullivan family in the wedding photograph. "You visiting Miss Sullivan?" the woman asked, her accent carrying the soft vowels and melodic cadence of Appalachian speech. "In a way," Margaret replied. "I'm a researcher, learning about her life. Did you know her?" The woman smiled, her weathered face lighting up. "Not personally, no. Miss Sullivan died when I was just a baby. But she taught my mother, and my mother never forgot her. Used to tell me stories about what a wonderful teacher she was, how she made learning exciting, how she believed every child could succeed if given the chance. My mother always said Miss Sullivan saved her life, helped her see there was a world beyond these mountains if she wanted to explore it." "That's beautiful," Margaret said. "Do you bring the flowers?" "Every year on her birthday," the woman confirmed. "My mother did it while she was alive, and now I do it. Mama taught me that you honor the people who made a difference in your life, who helped you become who you are. Miss Sullivan did that for her, so I keep her memory alive. It's the least I can do." They stood together in companionable silence for a moment, then the woman asked, "What made you interested in Miss Sullivan?" "She's been gone a long time." Margaret told her about the wedding photograph, about the mystery of Abigail appearing twice in the image, about learning the story of the family conflict and Abigail's brave decision to leave. As she spoke, she saw the woman's expression shift from curiosity to deep emotion. "I never knew that story," the woman said softly when Margaret finished. "Never knew Miss Sullivan had to give up her family to follow her dream. That makes what she accomplished even more remarkable, doesn't it? She could have been bitter, angry at the world. Instead, she dedicated her life to helping others. That takes real character." "It does," Margaret agreed. "I think she was an extraordinary person." "You should write about her," the woman said firmly. "Tell her story. Too many women like Miss Sullivan get forgotten by history. We remember the men who did important things, but we forget the women who quietly changed the world one student, one life at a time. Her story deserves to be known." Margaret returned to the Historical Society with renewed purpose. The woman at the cemetery had been right. Abigail Sullivan's story deserved to be told, not just as a historical curiosity about a strange photograph, but as an inspiring example of courage, determination, and the power of education to transform lives. Over the next several weeks, Margaret assembled everything she had learned into a comprehensive article for the Society's quarterly journal. But before she published anything, Margaret felt she needed to try one more thing. If there were any living descendants of the Sullivan family, they had a right to know about Abigail's life and accomplishments. Perhaps learning the full story might bring some healing to a wound that had festered for over a century. Through genealogical databases and with help from other researchers, Margaret traced the Howard family line. Catherine and James had 3 children, a son who died young, and 2 daughters who survived to adulthood, married, and had families of their own. The family tree eventually led Margaret to a woman named Elizabeth Howard Martin, age 78, living in Asheville. Margaret called Elizabeth, explained who she was and why she was calling. There was a long pause after Margaret mentioned the wedding photograph and Abigail Sullivan's name. "I've always wondered about Aunt Abigail," Elizabeth said quietly. "My grandmother, that would be Catherine, she never wanted to talk about her. But when I was a little girl, I found that wedding photograph in a drawer. I remember staring at it, confused about why the same woman appeared twice. When I asked Grandma about it, she got very upset, almost angry, and took the photograph away. She told me to never mention that name again. That must have been difficult, Margaret said gently. It was confusing more than anything, Elizabeth replied. As I got older, I pieced together bits of the story from overheard conversations and vague references. I knew Grandma had a sister who had left the family and never came back. I knew there had been some kind of falling out. But I never knew the details, and by the time I was old enough to ask more directly, Grandma was gone. Margaret told Elizabeth everything she had learned about Abigail, her career as a teacher, her community work, her dedication to helping young women from the mountains. As she spoke, she could hear emotion building in Elizabeth's voice. She was a teacher, Elizabeth said wonderingly. All this time and I never knew. My own daughter is a teacher, did you know that? 3rd grade in the city schools. She's wonderful with children, so patient and creative. I always wondered where she got that gift. Maybe it runs in the family after all. Would you like to see Abigail's grave? Margaret asked. I could take you there if you'd like. I would, Elizabeth said. Very much. And I'd like to bring my daughter, Sarah. She should know about her great-great-aunt, about what she accomplished. We all should have known, should have been proud of her all along. A week later, Margaret met Elizabeth and her daughter Sarah at Riverside Cemetery. It was a clear autumn morning, the kind of day when the mountains seemed especially vivid, their colors almost impossibly bright against the blue sky. Elizabeth walked slowly, using a cane, but her determination was evident in every step. Sarah, a woman in her early 40s with the same distinctive Sullivan features Margaret had seen in the wedding photograph, carried a large bouquet of mountain laurel. When they reached Abigail's grave, Elizabeth stood for a long moment, reading the simple inscription. Tears rolled down her weathered cheeks. All these years, she whispered, all these wasted years when we could have known her, learned from her, been proud of her. Our family let stubbornness and pride rob us of someone remarkable. Sarah placed the bouquet on the grave, then put her arm around her mother. We can't change the past, Mum, but we can honor her memory now. We can make sure her story is told, that people know what she did. Margaret showed them copies of the documents she had found, the city directory listings, the school employment records, the newspaper articles about Abigail's community work, the glowing obituary that celebrated her decades of service to education. Elizabeth read each document carefully, absorbing every detail about the aunt she had never been allowed to know. My grandmother carried such guilt, Elizabeth said after a long silence. I understand that now. She spent her whole life regretting what happened, but she never knew how to fix it, never knew if Abigail was even alive or if she would want contact even if she were. That's what the note on the back of the photograph was about, wasn't it? May God forgive us all for what we did to Abigail. Grandma was asking for forgiveness, but she was asking too late. Maybe not too late, Sarah suggested gently. We're here now. We're acknowledging what happened, honoring Aunt Abigail's memory. Maybe that counts for something. Margaret left the two women at the grave, giving them privacy for their own moment with their lost family member. As she walked back through the cemetery, she thought about the photograph that had started this entire journey. That strange double image, created by a compassionate photographer over a century ago, had seemed like a mystery to be solved. But Margaret now understood it was something more profound, a visual representation of the dualities that defined Abigail Sullivan's life, the tension between belonging and independence, between family loyalty and personal freedom, between who she was expected to be and who she chose to become. The photograph showed Abigail twice because, in a sense, there had been two Abigails. There was the Abigail her family wanted her to be, standing dutifully with them, conforming to their expectations, fulfilling her prescribed role. And there was the Abigail she truly was, standing apart, ready to step away from the frame, to begin her own journey, to write her own story. The photographer, with remarkable insight and compassion, had captured both of those Abigails in a single frame, creating a document that was simultaneously a family portrait and a farewell. Back at the Historical Society, Margaret put the finishing touches on her article. She titled it, "The Woman Who Appeared Twice," Abigail Sullivan and the Fight for Independence in Early 20th Century Appalachia. But as she prepared to send it to the journal for publication, she realized the story wasn't quite complete. She needed to understand more about the photographer, Thomas Garrett, the man who had created the unusual double exposure that had preserved Abigail's story for future generations. Research into Garrett proved challenging. Traveling photographers of that era rarely left extensive records, moving from town to town, working for cash, living itinerant lives. But Margaret eventually found references to him in several local newspaper archives. Thomas Garrett had been a reasonably well-known photographer in western North Carolina between 1895 and 1910, specializing in family portraits and community events. Several articles mentioned his innovative techniques and his reputation for being sympathetic to his subjects, particularly women and children. The most revealing information came from a 1908 interview Garrett gave to an Asheville newspaper about his photography career. In the interview, he discussed his approach to portraiture, emphasizing the importance of capturing not just faces but stories, not just moments but meanings. He said something that Margaret found deeply moving: "When I look through my camera, I try to see what people are feeling, not just how they look. Sometimes the most important thing about a person is what they're trying to become, not what they already are. A good photograph should honor that struggle, that journey from who we are to who we're meant to be." Margaret realized that this philosophy perfectly explained the wedding photograph. Garrett had seen Abigail's struggle, had witnessed the family conflict, and had understood the significance of the moment. By creating the double exposure, he had given Abigail something precious, a permanent record that she had been there, that she had mattered, that her presence at her sister's wedding was real and valid, even if her family wanted to deny it. He had also created a visual metaphor for her situation, showing her caught between two worlds, two versions of herself, two possible futures. The article Margaret wrote was published in the Historical Society's journal 6 months later. It attracted considerable attention, not just locally but nationally. Historians interested in Appalachian culture, gender studies scholars examining women's independence movements, and photography experts fascinated by early 20th century techniques all found something valuable in Abigail Sullivan's story. The wedding photograph was featured in several academic publications and eventually in an exhibition about women's lives in the Mountain South. But the impact that meant most to Margaret came from an unexpected source. 2 months after the article's publication, she received a letter from a woman named Helen Garrett, who identified herself as Thomas Garrett's granddaughter. Helen had read the article and wanted to share something her grandfather had written in a personal journal, a journal Helen had only recently discovered while sorting through family papers. The journal entry was dated June 20, 1901, just 5 days after the Sullivan-Howard wedding. In it, Thomas Garrett described photographing the wedding and the family conflict he had witnessed. His words brought the scene vividly to life. "I witnessed something today that has left me deeply troubled. The Sullivan girl, Abigail, the younger sister of the bride, came to the wedding though her father had forbidden it. She stood at a distance, watching the celebration, her face a mixture of sadness and defiance. When it came time for the family photograph, the father deliberately positioned people to exclude her, relegating her to the edge of the frame, making her invisible. I have photographed many families in my travels, and I have seen cruelty before, but there was something particularly painful about this rejection, happening as it did at what should have been a celebration of family unity." The journal entry continued. "After the official portrait was taken, I suggested rearranging people, pretending I needed to adjust the composition. In the confusion of people moving, I took a second exposure, this time including the Sullivan girl properly in the frame. Later, in my darkroom, I combined the two negatives, creating a print that shows her twice, both excluded and included, both invisible and seen. I don't know if the family will appreciate this or even understand it. But someday, perhaps, someone will look at this photograph and wonder about the girl who appears twice. And in that wondering, in that question, her story will live on. That seems important somehow, that her presence be acknowledged, that her existence be documented, even if only in this strange, doubled way." Margaret read this passage multiple times, tears blurring her vision. Thomas Garrett had understood exactly what he was creating. The photograph wasn't just a technical experiment or an artistic choice. It was an act of witness, a deliberate documentation of injustice, and a small act of resistance against the forces trying to erase Abigail from family history. He had known, somehow, that the photograph would outlast the immediate moment, that it would eventually speak to future viewers, that it would preserve Abigail's story when everyone who had known her was gone. Elizabeth Howard Martin, Catherine's granddaughter, became an advocate for preserving Abigail's legacy. She worked with the Historical Society to create a scholarship fund in Abigail's name, providing financial assistance to young women from rural areas who wanted to pursue careers in education. The scholarship was announced at a ceremony at Riverside Cemetery, where a new, larger tombstone was unveiled, replacing the modest marker that had stood there for decades. The new stone read, Abigail Sullivan, 1883 to 1951, teacher, mentor, pioneer. She left everything familiar to follow her dream, and in doing so, she changed countless lives. Her courage continues to inspire. Below that, in smaller letters, was a quote that Elizabeth had chosen carefully. The most important thing about a person is what they're trying to become, not what they already are. It was Thomas Garrett's philosophy, the principle that had guided him in creating the photograph that had preserved Abigail's story for future generations. At the unveiling ceremony, Sarah, Elizabeth's daughter and Abigail's great-great-niece, spoke to the small crowd that had gathered. Families are complicated, she said, her teacher's voice carrying clearly in the quiet cemetery. We hurt each other, sometimes intentionally, sometimes through ignorance or fear. The Sullivan family hurt Abigail by demanding she sacrifice her dreams for their expectations. But Abigail didn't let that hurt destroy her. She used it as motivation, as fuel for creating something better, not just for herself but for hundreds of children who benefited from her teaching and guidance. Sarah paused, looking at the new tombstone. I'm a teacher because I love helping children learn and grow. I always thought that passion came from nowhere in particular, just something I developed on my own. But now I know it runs in my blood, a gift passed down from an aunt I never knew, a woman who fought for the right to teach when her own family told her she couldn't. That connection means everything to me. It means I'm part of a legacy that began with an act of courage in 1901 and continues today in classrooms throughout this region. Margaret listened to Sarah's words, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why she had become a historian, why she spent her days poring over old photographs and documents, why she cared so passionately about preserving the past. History wasn't just about dates and facts. It was about people, about their struggles and triumphs, about the ways individual lives connected across time, creating threads of meaning that linked past to present to future. The wedding photograph that had started this entire journey now hung in a place of honor at the Historical Society, part of a permanent exhibition about women's lives in early 20th century Appalachia. The exhibition text told Abigail's story in detail, explaining the circumstances that led to the unusual double image, documenting her subsequent career and community work, and celebrating her courage in defying family expectations to pursue her dreams. Visitors often stood for long periods in front of the photograph, studying the two versions of Abigail, contemplating the choices she had faced and the path she had chosen. For Margaret, the photograph had become something more than a historical artifact or a research project. It was a reminder of the power of individual choice, the importance of honoring people's authentic selves, and the way small acts of compassion, like Thomas Garrett's creative photography, can ripple forward through time, touching lives and preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. On the last day of the exhibition's opening week, Margaret stood alone in the gallery after hours, looking at the photograph one final time before going home. In the soft gallery lighting, Abigail Sullivan's two images seemed almost alive, frozen in that moment of choice between family obligation and personal freedom. Margaret thought about how different Abigail's life might have been if she had stayed in Shelton Laurel, married someone approved by her father, lived the expected life of a mountain wife and mother. She would have been forgotten by history, just one of millions of women whose stories were never told, whose dreams were never pursued, whose potential was never realized. Instead, because of her courage and Thomas Garrett's compassion, Abigail Sullivan's story had survived. It had survived the family conflict that tried to erase her. It had survived the decades of silence and shame. It had survived the loss of memory as people who knew her died and time moved on. And now, more than a century after that wedding day in June 1901, Abigail's story was being told, her legacy was being honored, and young women were being helped to pursue their dreams through the scholarship that bore her name. Margaret turned off the gallery lights and locked the door behind her. Outside, the Asheville evening was cool and clear, the mountains visible in the distance, their ancient slopes unchanged since the day that photograph was taken. As she walked to her car, Margaret thought about all the Abigails who had lived and died in these mountains, women whose stories had never been preserved, whose courage had never been documented, whose names had been forgotten by history. Abigail Sullivan had been lucky. She had found an ally in Thomas Garrett, whose empathetic eye and creative skill had ensured her story would survive. She had achieved her dreams despite overwhelming obstacles. And she had touched countless lives through her dedication to education and helping others. But how many others, Margaret wondered, had not been so lucky? How many women had been crushed by family expectations, had given up their dreams, had lived lives of quiet desperation in mountain hollows and isolated farmhouses? Those stories, Margaret knew, were mostly lost forever, recoverable only in fragments, glimpses, the occasional cryptic note or unexplained detail in a historical document. That's what made this photograph so precious, Margaret realized. It wasn't just about Abigail Sullivan. It was about all the women like her, all the people who had struggled against the limitations placed on them by family, society, and circumstance. By telling Abigail's story, by honoring her courage and celebrating her achievements, Margaret was, in a small way, honoring all those other untold stories, acknowledging all those other forgotten lives. The exhibition would run for 6 months, then travel to other historical societies and museums throughout the region. The article had been reprinted in several publications. The scholarship fund was already receiving applications from young women eager to pursue teaching careers. And every year on Abigail's birthday, flowers would appear on her grave, placed there by people who had learned her story and wanted to honor her memory. It was, Margaret thought as she drove home through the mountain darkness, exactly what Thomas Garrett had hoped for when he created that unusual photograph more than a century ago. He had wanted Abigail's story to be remembered, her presence to be acknowledged, her existence to be documented. He had succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. The woman who appeared twice in that wedding photograph had become, through the power of that image and the story it preserved, a symbol of courage, independence, and the transformative power of education. And that, Margaret knew, was the true legacy of the photograph. Not the technical curiosity of how it was created or the historical mystery of why someone appeared twice, but the enduring human story it told about choice, courage, and the price of following your dreams. As long as people looked at that photograph and wondered about the woman who appeared twice, as long as they asked questions about who she was and what happened to her, Abigail Sullivan's story would continue to live, inspiring new generations to have the courage to become who they were meant to be, regardless of the obstacles they faced. The stars were brilliant above the mountains as Margaret reached her home, the same stars that had shone down on that wedding day in 1901, the same stars that had watched Abigail Sullivan walk away from her family and toward her future. History, Margaret thought, was full of such moments, individual acts of courage that changed lives and echoed through time. Her job was to find those moments, to preserve them, to tell the stories that deserved to be told. And in doing so, to remind people that the past wasn't dead and distant, but alive and relevant, full of lessons about how to live with courage, compassion, and commitment to what truly mattered.